The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus came to the territory of the Gadarenes, 2 demoniacs who were coming from the tombs met him. They were so savage that no one could travel by that road. They cried out, "What have you to do with us, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the appointed time?" Some distance away, a herd of many swine was feeding. The demons pleaded with him, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go then." They came out and entered the swine. And the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea where they drowned. The swineherds ran away. And when they came to the town, they reported everything, including what had happened to the demoniacs. Thereupon the whole town came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to leave their district. The Gospel of the Lord. Today we heard a little bit more about the story of Abraham and Hagar. Hagar, one of the fascinating stories from the Old Testament. Hagar is one of those stories that might seem like one of those many times in the Old Testament where it seems like it is good that we have moved beyond the culture of the Old Testament. Sometimes, particularly people, when they read the Bible, they'll say, I'm a New Testament Christian, right? And what they mean by that is that there's a lot of things in the Old Testament they don't care for. And one of the examples they might bring up is the treatment of women in the Old Testament. And this story of Hagar is one of those stories that they would likely point to. Right? Seemingly, God was condoning the abuse of this poor woman, Hagar. Likewise, it seems like God was condoning this affair that Abraham had with Hagar. Not a good thing. But I think if you understand the context of the story, it actually sheds some great light on this story of Hagar. She's actually one of the chosen people of God, one of the people that God specifically protected in the Old Testament. So what do you remember about Hagar? You remember the name of Abraham's wife, right? What was Abraham's wife's name? Sarai, right? And Hagar is the slave woman who appears about halfway through the story of their life. Does anybody know where Hagar came from? She came from Egypt. So, it's one of the subtle things in the story. Sometimes when we read the Old Testament, we think that just because it's mentioned, that means that somehow God is condoning what is happening. But even the fact that Hagar came from Egypt reveals something. Abraham was never commanded by God to go to Egypt. He was commanded to go to the land that he would show him. And along the way, he made a stop in Egypt. And his stop in Egypt was not very pleasant. He ended up lying and telling the Pharaoh that Sarai was not his wife, but his sister. And it caused a great turmoil in Egypt. There's a lack of courage on Abraham's part. Likewise, we see that Abraham, and during his time in Egypt, apparently acquired this slave woman, Hagar. Clearly something that God had never commanded him to do. So it's kind of a sign of his fickleness. Later on in the story, we hear about Hagar's conception of her son, whose name was Ishmael, right? And why did Hagar conceive the son Ishmael? Because God had promised Abraham and Sarai that he would give them a child. But they took matters into their own hands, and Abraham was given Hagar, the slave woman, to have relations with, and she gave birth to his son Ishmael. Again, many people see this as God condoning it because it's in the Bible. But if you keep reading the story, what happened right after this affair Abraham had with Hagar? There was a punishment that came along with it. God established the covenant of circumcision, right? The very unpleasant experience that Abraham would have to endure and the rest of his descendants as a reminder of who is truly in control. Not Abraham, but God himself. Right? One of those times we see that God was clearly punishing Abraham for what he had done, teaching him. Now, a couple of other things I really like about this story about Hagar. Hagar is an image of the Old Testament of someone who is assaulted forgotten, abused, alone. And yet there are many great things about the story about God's care for her. One of the things, for example, that you might have noticed, or if you pick up the book of Genesis and read this whole story, all throughout the story of Hagar, Abraham and Sarai never mention her by name. They always call her the slave woman. But when God sees Hagar abandoned, He calls her by name. He sees her. He knows her. He calls her by name. And He does the same for all of us when we feel completely rejected, abandoned. God sees us. He calls us by name. Hagar is also one of the few people in the Old Testament who not only is seen by God and rescued by God, but she actually gives a name to God. She calls God El Roi, or the God who sees. The God who sees me. Right? Beautiful. The last thing we see about this story of Hagar is the promise that she receives. Even though she is a poor slave woman from Egypt who is abandoned, she, like Abraham, also receives a promise from God for her child. She receives a promise for the future, that her son Ishmael would not be like her. He would not be a slave. He would not be assaulted, but he would be a wild ass of a man, a powerful warrior. And in fact, in Jewish tradition, we know that Ishmael, similar to Isaac and Jacob, his descendant, just like they were the 12 tribes of Israel, so later on in Jewish history there were 12 tribes of Ishmael. Even though he wasn't God's chosen nation, he was still a great nation. We have all of these things in context that show some of these very insightful and beautiful things about this story of Hagar.